All right, hello everybody, welcome back. So in this video, we are going to be talking more about research, and I want to differentiate between an academic source and a popular source. And if these are terms that are familiar to you, all the better, but please do stick around, watch all the way through, just because there might be some information here that will be helpful to you as you begin doing your research. So as we go about research, one of the things that I often insist or include in assignments is that students start with academic sources. And yes, there's a little bit more to the picture than that, but let's just go ahead and dive into the difference between academic and popular sources. Because I find that even though students may have a pretty good sense of the difference, there are some occasions when it can be difficult to tell whether or not a source is academic or whether it's popular. Now, I also think it's worth talking about this because we can talk about why you would want to use one or the other and how you can use both of them together in order to further strengthen your research. So let's start with a couple quick definitions here. So an academic source, which is also sometimes called a scholarly source or a peer-reviewed source, so we use those as synonyms. Those are sources that are written by a professor or a researcher or teams of professors or researchers, and they are published in what we call a peer-reviewed journal. And this is the important part. So when we think about an academic source, not only is it written by a professor or a researcher, but it is also published in a peer-reviewed journal. Now, I think this is where things get a little bit confusing for some folks, because there are articles in popular sources written by professors or researchers, and people assume then that because of who wrote it, it is then a academic or peer-reviewed source. So we have to really kind of dive into this question of what it means for something to be peer-reviewed. Well, of course, you've probably been in classes where you've done a peer review and you come to class and you exchange your paper with another student in the class, and you read their paper and they read your paper, and you make comments, and hopefully they're helpful comments, and you trade them back, and then you can go and you can improve that paper. Well, it's kind of the same idea. So in essence, a peer-reviewed source means that the author, whether that is a professor or a researcher or a graduate student, has conducted some research, they've written a paper or an essay or an article, and then they've submitted it to an academic or peer-reviewed journal. And then that piece of writing is sort of checked by experts or other professionals in the field, ideally. So let's say a doctor is researching causes of lung cancer, then the article that they write will be checked by other people who specialize in the field of cancer. And this checking process can take weeks or months. So the article is reviewed by people and peers of the person who wrote the article. Now, I will give you another quick example that will lead us into what a popular source is. Now, in my younger days, when I was doing freelance writing, usually I would have a deadline that was within maybe a week or a couple months, maybe away. So I would have some time to do interviews or do my own personal research or go to a place or whatever it was. And then I would write my article and I would submit it to an editor. Now, the editor wasn't checking to make sure that my facts were accurate. They were just checking to make sure that things flowed smoothly and that there are commas in the right places and all of those things. Some places do have fact checkers, but it's kind of a rarity these days, at least from what I understand. So a peer-reviewed source, on the other hand, is submitted, right? Somebody spends all this time doing research, maybe years doing research. They submit the paper, and then it is checked, and it might take a period of months or a year in order for that article to be then published in a peer-reviewed journal. Now, on the other side, a popular source is something that's written by a journalist, maybe a professor, maybe a researcher, and it's published in a newspaper, a magazine, or a website. Now, the intent here is rather different, right? Because what does it mean for a source to be popular? Well, it doesn't necessarily mean that they have a lot of friends or that they have a lot of followers, although that always helps. What it means is that it is an article or an essay that is published for people who are not specialists, people that maybe don't have a background, and the goal is to convey information to the general public. So you get most magazines and newspapers, things like that. Again, a professor can publish in a popular source. They do so pretty often, but just because somebody is a professor or a researcher does not automatically make a source a peer-reviewed source. So when we think about academic versus popular, the thing that you should think about really is where that thing was published. So let's talk about that a little bit more, and let's look at a couple examples. So examples of good, reputable, reliable, popular sources might be things like the National Geographic, Forbes, the Seattle Times, the BBC. Now these are, publishing companies and magazines and websites that have a good reputation. People know who they are. They are, ethical journalists and those sorts of things. Academic sources I like to think of as these are not the things that are going to be in kind of the doctor's office waiting room, right? The Lancet is one of the premier medical journals in the world, and it's something that your doctor might read, but it's probably not going to be laying around in the waiting room because most people aren't going to necessarily have the background or the knowledge to pick that up, read it, and really comprehend it. So the American Journal of Sociology, Modern Fiction Studies, Physics Reports, these are very specialized fields and very specialized journals that are read by people within that field. So again, just know that when we're thinking about popular sources versus academic sources, it's more where that article was published, was it peer-reviewed, than who wrote the source. Now, the next question, of course, and I'm glad that you asked, is can you use both types of sources in an academic paper? If so, how? Well, hopefully you're thinking, yeah, of course you could use both. Why wouldn't you? And that is absolutely true, at least for the writing that I have my students do. You can absolutely use both types of sources in an academic paper, and it is incredibly advantageous to do so. So the thing that we have to do is we have to figure out how we can actually use those sources together. And there are a couple ways to think about this. So let's just look at advantages and disadvantages first. So if we think about academic sources, and you could pause the video and think about this for a minute, what might be the advantages? Well, they provide concrete evidence. If it's a scientific study, there are going to be percentages and standards of deviation and charts and graphs and all sorts of quantitative data that you could use to support your claim or claims within your paper. They add authority to your paper because the person or people who have written that article are generally experts. And of course, you could think about authority bias here. Again, that's something that we want to keep in mind, that we're not just trusting the paper or the argument because the person who wrote it has a PhD. They can show that you have a deeper level of understanding because you've gone out of your way to dig deeper into a topic, really getting into kind of the nitty-gritty details of an issue. But there are some disadvantages, right? So they are typically much more dense and much longer than anything that we would usually read. A academic peer-reviewed article might be 20, 30, 40, 50 pages long. If that is the case, you're probably not going to want to read the whole thing, and we can talk about that in a separate video, how to approach it. So academic sources, they've got a lot of authority, they've got a lot of concrete data, and that is helpful, but they can be really tough to quote or pull from because they are so dense. Now, popular sources, on the other hand, generally provide a lot of quotable material. And this is because of audience. They're writing for kind of us average folks who may not be experts in a field. They're a little bit more familiar, a little bit more laid back in tone, usually a little bit more conversational. So all of that is good. And, you can kind of think of it as tip of the iceberg. Usually, not always, but usually a popular source is just kind of giving broad strokes. They're just kind of giving us the general overview of the material. And then, we leave it to the academic sources to really dig into things a little bit more deeply. Now, what are the disadvantages? Well, they can be very brief. As I said, they're kind of tip of the iceberg, kind of surface level. And as such, they may not provide a whole lot of detail. So the best way to combine these is to do that in a paragraph. Use one to cross-check the other. Now, what I usually say is look at the academic sources first, and then branch out into more of the popular sources so you can get a little bit more of an understanding. Now, that's not to say that it's linear, that you're going to look at academic and then you're going to look at popular. You should be doing this on a sort of, cycle, if you will, where you're looking at academic sources and popular sources and academic and popular, because you really want to be able to use them together. Now, why start with academic sources? Again, the reason that I require students to start with academic sources is really because it helps provide you with a firm footing and foundation to understand a topic. And once you've got that firm understanding of the topic, then you can turn towards popular sources, and it will be easier for you to tell whether or not the information is accurate or recent or so on and so forth, because you've already got that background. Now, I think earlier on I said that, yes, I want students to start with academic sources, but not exactly. So I usually think of research as phases. It's just the way my mind works. And maybe that's cyclical phases as we go round and around. But one thing that I generally suggest students start with is what I call passive research. Now, passive research is my term for when you're just kind of starting to get a general background. Maybe you're looking at Wikipedia or TED Talks or YouTube, and it's not necessarily that you are going to quote those sources, right? Because, obviously I personally have an injunction against using Wikipedia as a quotable source. But what you're really just trying to do is wrap your head around the basics, right? What's the terminology? What are the keywords? Things like that. And just kind of getting a little bit of momentum before you then go into academic sources. Now, one reason for starting with that sort of casual passive research is that you can really figure out whether or not this is something you want to continue to research. If you're doing that casual passive research and you're like, yeah, I really still like this topic, then it's time to go ahead and move into the academic sources. And then you can return to popular sources, and you just want to make sure that they are reliable popular sources, and that's something that I'll cover in a separate video. So again, to use them together, popular sources in a nutshell, easy to read, easy to quote. Academic sources are carefully vetted, they're more thorough research. It's really best to use them together. One should support the other. Again, if you think of it as quantitative data and something that's nice and quotable, that works. I don't have any rule for how many sources that one should have in a particular paragraph or how many quotes. And there's definitely such a thing as oversaturation of data or quotable material. But if you use these sources together, it should strengthen your essay. And even if within a paper you're using primarily academic sources, varying it with a popular source can be really, really helpful as you begin to sort of build a bigger picture of what your actual argument is. So there you go. If you have any questions, comments, concerns, jokes, memes, or recipes, please let me know. Otherwise, I'll talk to you all in the future.